We're going to be exploring liberalism, so the current political paradigm, but in reference to the totalising claim that's made on time when it's presupposed to be a value, and the way how that we divide the self when we practice existential arbitrage. This will be a good way to look at the divide between politics. And if we can't connect the divide between politics to arbitrage, so what we absence when we're sold on a risk-free proposition that a buyer's journey is, then we can't give context to the spiritual questions our lives pose if we get beholden to politics, because ultimately politics completely jettisons the question of spirituality. So how can we say that to begin with? Well, life is a compensatory exercise. So liberalism as a paradigm ultimately just immanentizes a commercial worldview. Now, it might have the pretense to support freedom of speech, the right of property, obviously less interference from the state. And so it's orientated towards freedom. Now, that freedom is, we're going to put freedom in context because we'll come back to it. So liberty is constrained by non-questioning. We could say that there is also the rule of law, which kind of transcends liberalism. But if we're all orientated towards our understanding of the principles, but we don't give context to the form of life that we inhabit as a vehicle for those values, then what we're doing is we're not considering it from the existential basis of how we're given in liberalism. And I've talked about that if liberalism has been an intellectual kind of framework that has actualized the totalising claim of a buyer's journey, then ultimately we have to look at the form of life, because the form of life is what is shared irrespective of the divide in the politics. And so therefore we can look at it from the spirituality of a compensation literally as a principle, or a return compared to Genesis, as it were. And this becomes religious as much as it's framed outside, probably within the West in particular, the way how Genesis gets framed, say, through the Bible. We have to look at it from one day. And so therefore we can look at creativity, or what we absence when we're given as passive or as consumers, and not co-creators, because ultimately God is the creator. And so all we're doing is we're managing a paradigm, but we're not considering the way how through our own management we produce a very form of life that actually limits our agency and doesn't do justice to being born. And so therefore, how can we do justice to being born when life is a compensation, or when we're twice born through the use of a credit we are not the originator of? So we can look at liberalism through the prism of liberty, but then through the production process, because we talked about, to be a consumer, nobody questions their production process. All right, and then as a result of that, the emission of that question, they don't think the nature of the claim that's made on them when life's given as a buyer's journey. And because they don't understand, because they're not questioning the production process, they don't understand what's the means that's utilised to produce a form of life, to sanction the way how things are given, even our politics, the way how people get sold on difference, on left, right, because the spirituality is completely jettisoned. And so in that case, if you think, okay, that the emission of that question, well, if time is given as a value, and we always talk about the nature of that, if a person was to say that your time is not valuable, people wouldn't have an issue with that, because we're orientated in a way that we discount. Because that's the only way that you can be orientated towards life is if you discount. We can cover this off in in episodes when we deal with present discounted value of money. You've got to look at investments, because you are an asset, and so therefore the way how present discounted value as a principle that relates to different forms of investment actually applies to the self, but we don't understand this. And so when we're orientated towards compensation or a return, we are simultaneously discounting. The simultaneity of that is in reference to existential arbitrage. So in order for you to be sold, or you circumscribe what you can do because you can only demand. And so therefore, through demand, you simultaneously discount the agency. All right, but because we don't question that, it's been externalized. And so if it's externalized, it's given over to people to manage our redundancy, as they say, you're a product. And so the one question, that omission of the question of the production process, is such that people don't reflect upon whether or not they have a choice on the way how time's given to them. Because if you're orientated towards your own time when it's given as an individualized pursuit, fine, that's all well and good. But ultimately, the value of your time is not in reference to your life, because there's a totalising claim made on it, irrespective of the way you sell yourself. Otherwise, it's a consumer that you are. So it's always transcendent. So once again, that poses the question, do we have a choice on the way how time's given? If we don't, then all the pretense of liberalism when it talks about liberty, okay, it's a very impoverished understanding of what liberty is. Because once again, if liberalism has just been the vehicle to immanentize or to legitimize, let's say, a commercial orientation for life, then you have to look at the principal product that you are, irrespective of the politics that hold sway. So it doesn't matter the way how liberalism gets repackaged as, social democracy or neoliberalism, let's say, or any of the varieties that we're all probably aware of it, and the supposed divide in politics. There's divide, but when you're looking at it from a form of life that is transcendent on the existential claim that's made on the person, it's immaterial in the sense that you've got to think that if people are, let's say, for instance, I'll give you an example, when you're dealing with social justice, that's just a value add for people that are oriented towards life like everybody else is a buyer's journey, but because they're not acquitting themselves of the claim made on time, whereby they're orientated towards their time as a value proposition, so therefore they're wanting to see life as, you have to see life as a compensation, so you're seeking a return for that investment to improve the proposition that your life will come through what you're credited as a consumer, so you can only demand, and so in turn obviously create a life. These people maybe in a way, they see a compensation through the values. All right, so they will invest in collective movements, all right, to have a way of finding meaning, all right, in the consumer that they have to be. You've got to think that you don't disqualify the consumer that you are just because you're invested in collective movements or in it. There's a spiritual aspiration. So when you look at these things, you can see, as much as that they might be totally off base, as it were, there's an underlying aspiration for change that's always externalized. This is half the problem. It's never about the self, and this goes for all people. It's never about the self in reference to the claim that you acquit yourself of. And so any self is always, it's like self-improvement, or it's like, optimization. It's all these things that are always subordinate, derivative. Because why? Well, the question that we're focusing on is that can you make a choice on the way how time's given to you? If you can't, then you're beholden to a command economy. And so a command economy does not differ from one side of politics to the other. Once again, so if it's a command economy and you're the product, you've got to think that you're the principal product that our commercial paradigm, that liberalism say has actualized. You're the product. And so the spiritual question of your status, all right, so you've got to think that you're a credit instrument, as I always say. You're a credit instrument. You don't understand that status is contingent upon one question that you refuse to ask. So that's the production process of the consumer and the means of your production, and then ultimately whether or not you have a choice on the way how time's given to you. If you don't have a choice on the way how time's given to you, it's a command economy. It's existential totalitarianism. And so any person that talks about liberalism, about let's say, if we're looking at the West, well, liberalism is failing through literally through its own philosophy, we could say. Okay, but that still doesn't, you're still not addressing the status of redundancy when you're given as a product. A person has been reduced into a product. People aren't people. And so if you don't see beyond the current kind of like din of white noise as far as contesting a conversation, let's say, in reference to what? Competing claims over the institutions that are meant to be the vehicles for people. All right, think about that. People, all right? Well, are they people? Are they people, or are they just consumers, and so they're orientated towards a limitation of agency? And this predates the modern, really, as it were, and it goes back further. So if it goes back further, you're looking at what drives secularization as a religion, and ultimately the bad faith that we obviously are adherents of when we don't question whether or not time is of value or not. Because if we were to question it, we'd say, hang on, that's a spiritual disease, because it's what it's saying is there is a value judgment that's been made that time is of value. We acquit ourselves of that claim. We outsource our thinking, and we outsource our thinking through politics becoming this kind of a way of framing conversation, when you have to step outside of that and to look at it, because the balancing, let's say the balancing inverted between left and right, think of existential arbitrage, like your work-life balance. You're an actuary of a system, as I say. An actuary is a person that looks at uncertainty, risk. A buyer's journey is a risk-free proposition through existential arbitrage. All right, so this is where we're at. We're not even close towards getting some kind of resolution that relates to like Western man, as it were, the last man. When we're not looking at the principal issue of what drives your actions of spirituality. Is it independence or indivisibility is the question, or to do justice to being born by not being twice born through the use of a credit we are not the originators of. Anyway, cheers.